Happy Friday, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Most of you, I saw a bunch of old friends from Durham. There's a lot of folks that are from Raleigh, and I think almost everybody is from the region. As you probably know, our region is the second fastest growing metro in the country. That brings incredible opportunity and incredible challenges. The most significant of those challenges, in my judgment, is what it's done to housing prices, right? Because of the demand to live in our region, housing prices have accelerated massively. That's happened in every growing city across the country, but it's happened more so here than almost anywhere else, certainly in the Southeast. And again, you all, this is part of your lived experience. You all in this room are some of the most important people to help our communities address this biggest problem, which is finding a way to make sure there's room for all families, all households, all people who want to live in our city and in our region, and make sure that they have a chance to afford to do so. The growth that I talked about has economically displaced many, and we have to change that story. You all in this room also well know that a lot of new development, most new development, is funded by global capital, right? Wall Street, REITs, top-down development. What this room represents is the hope for smaller scale or incremental development. Incremental development, I was talking to Topher Thomas right before this, is many hands. It takes an ecosystem, a network of nonprofits, lenders, small builders, mission-based organizations to work collaboratively to allow folks that don't have the resources of Wall Street to be part of solving our problem, our affordable housing problem. And I'm incredibly grateful and optimistic of our ability to influence it with the energy and folks in this room, many of which have been working in this space for a long time and have had a lot of success. So what you're going to hear about today is really kind of three things. One is just an overview of kind of our processes here in Raleigh, of the development process and kind of tools and resources and opportunities for small-scale home builders. We don't want our rules and regulations, which are significant. We have almost 600 pages of rules, some of which are very complex and can be very daunting and make a very difficult process even more difficult. We really have a commitment to making that easier, more accessible, and to supporting you and being your partner and getting through that process. And today is a kind of a down payment on that. Going forward, if you don't feel like we're being that kind of partner, reach out to me, reach out to Keegan McDonald, who you'll hear from in a moment, and we'll help you, because we need you as small-scale home builders to create the kind of housing that can be more affordable by design and more affordable because of the way it's built. Second, we're going to have a panel of some really incredible folks that have been, again, in this space, in our region, in our city, for a long time, and I think learned some lessons about the good, bad, and the ugly of what they've seen and how we can do it better and different. And then finally, and I think equally importantly, we're going to have some conversation at tables with our different program area specialists. The biggest impediment to development is usually not building homes. Many of you in this room are really, really good at that. It's transportation, stormwater, utilities, planning and zoning requirements. So we have folks in this room that are specialists from every discipline that can answer your questions. If we can't answer them today, we'll follow up with you, but we do have the folks in this room that can go through that. So that's kind of our show flow. Really appreciate you being here. I hope you find it useful. I'll be here, be happy to meet and talk with any of you, and thanks again for coming out. With that, I'm going to introduce Keegan McDonald, who's a supervisor in our land use and zoning division, who's going to give you kind of an overview of why we're here and how we can work together to promote these goals. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Pat. Really appreciate the introduction. Great to see everyone here today. As Pat said, my name is Keegan McDonald. I am a planning supervisor here at the city. And so this part of the program will really focus on process and policy as it relates to the city of Raleigh. For some of you, this information will be things that you already know. For some of you, it will be entirely new. Either way, I anticipate that it'll be a lot of information, which is why we are going to be providing you with a full presentation after today's event. And we really hope it can serve as sort of a one-stop resource for you to go and investigate questions that you may have, at least give you some foundational knowledge about each of these topic areas. So before we get into the details, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why we're here. And some of you may have seen this information as we went to our city council and also out to our community during engagement sessions over the past few months. But this map here, I think, is really descriptive of the types of dynamics we see here in Raleigh and also other cities across the region and the country, a concept that we've termed the Great Inversion, which really represents a growing interest in change in behavior and preference for in-town and more urban living. And that's expressed through really tremendous demand. You can see here that change in land values spiking within the center part of Raleigh. And so Raleigh is at sort of an inflection point, like many cities now, learning how to grow inward instead of just outward. We of course have neighbors, and Raleigh still sees growth towards its suburban and exurban areas. But there is a tremendous amount of interest in infill development, people seeking out the kind of places and experiences that our urban areas offer. And that ties directly into the topic of the day, which is small scale development. And of course, too, we've seen a growing interest in different types of housing for different people at different life stages, different lifestyle preferences, different income levels. Historically, there's been fairly limited options, and to be quite frank, not everyone is well suited to live either in a large apartment complex or a detached house, and that could be for a variety of reasons. And so Raleigh has taken steps over the past few years to really open up different housing types and make them permissible in the city. And so that's some of what I'll be covering today. And then there's ancillary benefits, which I think are equally or more important in some instances to this type of development. One of the principal ones being energy usage. As we know, connected units that have shared walls, shared infrastructure, consume a lot less energy, which is really integral towards the city of Raleigh meeting its climate goals, and again, offers to kind of direct benefits to the occupants of those units. The city is also investing really heavily right now in our transit network. We have a bus rapid transit plan that is underway for 4 different lines throughout the city, and evidence shows that places that are more dense, that are more walkable, tend to support transit better and have higher transit usage. And so this type of development really ties directly into that effort and those goals as well. And we know that transportation choices, again, kind of getting back to the sustainability and environmental benefits, really affect emissions, and that places that are incrementally developed at a smaller scale tend to invite more walking and biking, which produce far less emissions than driving. And we're really trying to create the types of places that people love today and to kind of expand upon that for the future. And so for a whole host of reasons, that's why we're here today for these and others, to really kind of usher in, hopefully, the next step in Raleigh's growth, which is growing in rather than growing out, as I mentioned before. So to start things off, I wanted to talk a little bit about how you understand, kind of the starting point for understanding what can be built in Raleigh. And I think that really starts with the zoning code. And I'm sure many of you are familiar, but for those who are not, zoning really refers to a designation on every piece of land throughout the city, which tells you what can be built there. Every zoning code is a little bit different, and this provides sort of a high-level breakdown of how to interpret a zoning designation on a piece of property. So principally, we've split Raleigh zoning into 2 different categories. Those are mixed use and residential. And so the majority of today's conversation will focus on the residential piece, because that's where most of our neighborhoods are, and also where there's more variation in terms of what type of housing can be built. And so just to break down that residential zoning code designation, the R tells you it's residential. The number roughly corresponds to the allowable density. So the lower the number, the lower the potential residential density on a piece of property, meaning the fewer number of units that can be built. And then that CU you're not likely to encounter too often, but it's critically important if you do, which tells you that there are some type of conditions that have been placed on the property which may limit specific uses or other types of design function of the property. And so if you're just starting off, if you have a piece of property you're interested in, this is really kind of the first step, is to understand the zoning designation on that property. And you'll see that hyperlink in blue, or excuse me, in teal in the bottom left of the screen. And you'll see that throughout the presentation. I've tried to note code references to our Unified Development Ordinance, which is what Pat was referencing, and then also some important hyperlinks. So you can travel to either that code section or to that web page to get more information on the topic for that page. And so this Find My Zoning page kind of walks you through step by step how to use our mapping service so you can understand the zoning on a particular piece of property. So once you understand the zoning, you may be curious about what exactly can be built. And Raleigh has a hybrid form-based code, which means we have regulations pertaining to different types of buildings. And so I wanted to walk through what those building types are. Many of them will be familiar to you all, but sometimes the terminology, as you'll see, varies from city to city. So this is just an effort to kind of make sure we're all working with the same knowledge about different types of housing. So I'll start off with some of our less intensive types of housing. ADU stands for accessory dwelling unit. I'm sure that's something many folks are familiar with. Essentially, that's a separate dwelling unit that might reside on a lot with a principal dwelling unit. It, again, requires basically another principal structure on the site for an ADU to be constructed. A detached house is probably the most common one most people are familiar with, otherwise known as a single-family home. So this is just a single structure on a lot that houses just one unit, and that's by far the most predominant type of housing we see in Raleigh. Tiny house. So this is a relatively new addition to the city. I'm sure folks have seen TV shows, et cetera, that talk about tiny houses. Here in Raleigh, it's better to understand it sort of as a small home. It can be quite small if you so choose, but the limits we place are roughly 1,200 square feet in floor area and 2 stories. And we'll get into a little bit more about each of these and the development standards associated with them. But tiny house is a relatively new option that can be used either for a single family or can actually be split out and used as 2 units. And then moving on to the other 3, which are a little bit more intensive and offer higher kind of residential densities. Those are attached house, more commonly known as duplex. So this is just a single building that would have 2 units in one lot. Townhouses are units, 2 or more dwelling units, that are horizontally integrated and where each unit is separated by a vertical party wall. So this is pretty prominent as well. I would say in terms of small scale development, this is probably the most common that you see here in Raleigh and elsewhere. What's also unique about the townhouse product is that each unit can reside on its own lot. So you're able to subdivide off those townhouse units. You can also employ a condominium form of ownership under Raleigh's code if you'd like, meaning that they all reside on a single piece of property. And then last is apartments. That really encompasses everything else multifamily. If you have horizontal or vertical integration, meaning units stacked atop one another, that would fall really into the apartment class if it's 3 or more units. So triplexes, quads, other small type garden apartments, under Raleigh's code, we'd consider those apartments. And so moving on from the building types into what options there are to develop under. So those building types fit into a variety of different development options, and the most common of those is the conventional development option. And so this is really available pretty much anywhere throughout the city where that particular building type is permitted. And so I'll start with tiny houses. We talked about earlier that tiny houses under our code are required to be smaller. There are caps on the size of the units, but for that reason, they are offered or afforded, density bonus, meaning you can build more tiny houses on a lot than you could standard larger single-family homes. Some other unique aspects of tiny houses is that they can actually be constructed as manufactured homes. So they would have to be HUD certified, but that gives you another building type option here in Raleigh. There are limitations, further limitations on size if they are manufactured homes, and there's also some design standards as well. Again, just to orient you as we move through these slides, you'll see that UDO code reference. So if you're interested in this building type, we highly encourage you to go check out what the full list of standards are in our Unified Development Ordinance. And then just as a quick reference, there's a table or tabular data at the bottom that kind of shows the potential yield for each of those zoning districts. And so that's expressed in dwelling units per acre, just so you can get a sense for how many units might be able to fit on a piece of property. Attached houses, again, more commonly known as duplexes. I think the main takeaway here in Raleigh is that recent changes have now made it possible to build a duplex anywhere you can build a detached house. So they follow the same exact dimensional standards, and for that reason, they are afforded essentially twice the amount of potential density there. So you can see those density allowances in the data below. Townhouses, so 2-unit townhouses, meaning just 2 units connected to one another. Those are treated exactly the same as duplexes under our code. We do call them townhouses just because there is the option, again, to subdivide. But once you get into a 3+ unit development, if that's something you're interested in, those are a little bit more limited in terms of the districts that they're permitted in. So those are only permitted in our R6 and R10 districts under this conventional option. Those are kind of medium and higher density residential areas of the city. Other unique aspect is that townhouses can be located on a drive aisle, meaning you don't have to have every unit fronting on a street, a public street. So you can have a loaded set of townhomes that kind of move perpendicular from the street. And that's relatively recent change. There are some limitations from our transportation group, but just something to be mindful of. It gives you a little bit more flexibility if you're trying to pursue that model on a smaller site. And then last, apartments. So as I mentioned earlier, apartments really refer to anything that's 3+ units, and if you have that kind of stacking or horizontal integration, vertical integration, excuse me, so triplexes, quads, et cetera, they are able to be built at higher densities just given that the units are typically smaller. And for that reason, within our residential areas of the city, they're only permitted in the R10 district, which is our most dense residential district. And so just wanted to show that this really is kind of possible even in infill areas of the city. So this is just a property over in the eastern part of Raleigh. You can see where there's an existing house today, just under 10,000 square feet in size. And you can see that it could easily accommodate a 3+ unit development, a 3-unit apartment development under today's code provisions, even with the applicable setbacks related to the building and parking. And this is just really meant to be illustrative, not saying this is how you have to design your property, but just want to show that the regulations are set up to hopefully work on most of the properties with that zoning classification throughout the city. So now moving on from the conventional development option, we're going to talk a little bit about housing patterns. And so I don't want you to pay too much attention to that phrase, but just know that's what how we've kind of grouped these next set of possibilities. One of those is ADUs. So we consider an ADU a housing pattern here in Raleigh. And important things to know about ADU construction is that one is permitted per lot regardless of density. So even if you have a single family home or a duplex there, one can be built per lot. Now the only building types they are permitted with are single family homes, duplexes, and 2-unit townhouses, and then other townhouse developments. The one caveat being if you have a row of townhomes, each townhouse lot can only have that one ADU. Now they can also be detached or attached from the principal structure. If they are detached, let's say located in the rear yard of a property, then there are setback requirements, although they're fairly minimal for most lots. Other things to be mindful of is that ADUs per our code cannot be transferred or sold separately from the principal dwelling, so they kind of are sold in a package. However, ADUs can be used as short-term rentals, so think Airbnb, VRBO. so that if that's of interest, that is permissible, at least today, under our code. And then the cousin of ADUs are flag lots. So people might be familiar with this concept, particularly in more rural areas. Used to be prohibited under our code, but we've recently made allowances for flag lots. And really the advantage here is if you have interest in selling the unit and then also providing someone with the opportunity to own the land underneath the unit as well. So essentially, a flag lot, as the name describes, is a flag-shaped parcel that's kind of subdivided off a larger parcel. And typically what that looks like is a narrow kind of driveway or pole that fronts the street, and that provides access to a larger portion of the lot to the rear. That lot that's left over, we call it the residual lot, and that lot does get some special permissions to be narrower and less deep than a standard lot, just understanding that you need space for that flag lot. And just also want to be mindful that there could be transportation-related implications of a flag lot typology in terms of driveways and that type of thing. The city still does need to manage ingress and egress and the safety of movement of vehicles on and off the site. So just something to be mindful of if you're on a busier street, that the flag lot option could require a shared driveway scenario or something else to provide that access. And then last is cottage court. So this has actually been in our code for some time, and we've tweaked it numerous times over the years. What essentially this refers to is a cluster of smaller homes that surround a common courtyard. So there are special provisions and design standards for that courtyard area. It's essentially meant to be a shared common open space that fronts the street, and then the units can be dispersed around that courtyard. One unique thing too about this is that you can actually create a cottage court subdivision, so each unit could reside on its own lot and be sold separately, or you could pursue it as just a single development that's condominiumized. And in exchange for the units being smaller, there is a density bonus afforded to cottage courts over and above the standard kind of single-family subdivision under that conventional option that we talked about earlier. And next, we're going to move into compact and conservation. So I think many of you might know these as cluster developments. The principal concept here is we allow for different building types at higher densities and sometimes reduced setbacks within various zoning districts in exchange for preserving common open space. So with compact, there's a requirement to preserve 20% of your site as common open space, and I'll get into the detail on that in a moment. With conservation, really the main difference there is you have to set aside 40% open space. So those are the two options if you want to pursue a cluster type development. What's notable is that with the compact option, you can actually build townhouses in the R4 district. So that opens it up in an area otherwise where you couldn't build townhouses if you choose to pursue this compact option. And you can see that the residential density is actually a little higher there as well. Conservation, just touch on this quickly again, there's that 40% requirement for open space. What's notable, again, townhouses are permitted in our R2 and R4 districts, which are some of our less dense residential districts, and you can also do apartments in R6. And so those sections of the code that I'm referencing, 2.3 and 2.4, those will provide information on what type of housing mix is expected or required, meaning what percentage of the site could be developed with townhouses, what percentage could be developed with apartments, et cetera. So that'll provide you information on those possibilities. And the code does set forth open space hierarchy, meaning the types of open space that we're going to require you to preserve first before you preserve others. And so that primary are typically areas you wouldn't want to build in anyways, or environmentally sensitive spots, floodways, very steep slopes. And then you move on to secondary, which covers our floodway fringe and future condition flood hazard areas. And then tertiary, historic sites, species habitat, greenway connections, et cetera. There are other expectations for the open space in terms of proximity to the units and that type of thing. So if this interests you, definitely want to take a detailed look at 2.5. And moving on to our newest development option, which is the frequent transit development option. And so the frequent transit development option is available to parcels that reside within a designated frequent transit area. And so this is a relatively new concept. And what a frequent transit area means is any lot that's within a half mile of a planned bus rapid transit route or a quarter mile from a frequent transit route. And those are incorporated into both the city's comprehensive plan, but also the 2030 Wake Transit Plan. So that's how we got those designations. And that is viewable on iMaps, our mapping software as well, if you want to be able to locate whether or not your property is within one of those frequent transit areas. So if you're within one of those areas, this option is available to that piece of property. And essentially what it does is open up the palette of allowable building types. So you can construct apartments there, townhouses, duplexes, et cetera. And all of those building types are afforded density bonus over and above a conventional development. And you can see how it's broken out in that table. Basically, single family homes, duplexes, townhouses, and apartments, and you can see the potential yields there. So there are some things to be mindful of if you want to pursue a larger scale development. So any project that's over 12 units, there are affordability requirements that will come into play with that development. So that's basically the exchange going on. Larger scale developments will be held to providing a percentage, in this case 20% of the units over 12 must be affordable. So you might be asking, what do you mean by affordable? So the city maintains a definition of what's meant by affordable. In this case, it's affordable for households earning 60% of the area median income or less for a period of no less than 30 years, meaning you have to have that affordability provision in place for a period of a minimum period of 30 years. And so once you move through that process, it's actually managed in part by our Housing and Neighborhoods group. They'll help you understand what the actual income limits are for those rental units, and it's something that's memorialized via deed restriction when you move forward with the project. Just like most other affordable housing endeavors, there is a requirement for annual reporting. So so you can basically testify, and the city can confirm that you are renting those units at that specific income level. And so that really provides an overview of the development options and housing patterns that are available to you all. But I want to make you aware of some other considerations as you're pursuing a particular piece of property. And these are things that could pose a challenge in some instances. So we want to make you aware. The first is overlay districts. So an overlay district just refers to an added layer of zoning that might apply to a piece of property. So I could be looking in a neighborhood, and for instance, there could be a neighborhood conservation overlay district atop that piece of property. And in the case of a neighborhood conservation overlay district, or NCOD, that could further restrict building height, setbacks, lot size, and in most instances it controls, so that you need to be very mindful if you're pursuing a project and it has an NCOD, that could have implications for exactly the design or possibilities on the site. The city is also in the process of mapping transit overlay districts. And so those will be primarily along those bus rapid transit corridors. Right now, the only line that's mapped is along the western BRT line. The transit overlay district in most instances provides for greater possibility residential density, but it also limits certain auto-oriented uses, so, such as car sales and that type of thing. So just something to be mindful of if you were pursuing a project in that area. And then historic overlays, those are within specific areas of the city where any change to the exterior of a building or any new building has to go through a process with called a certificate of appropriateness, where basically you are receiving approval that you're matching the historic character of the neighborhood. And some of those more minor improvements will be approved and considered by staff, but more major ones you have to go to our Historic Development Commission, and there's a hearing where you'll have to put on evidence and show how you're essentially matching the historic character. Residential infill compatibility, this refers to standards that we have for existing neighborhoods. So if you're looking at a piece of property that's on a street that's 20 years or older, and you have neighboring properties within the vicinity, neighboring structures within the vicinity, there's a good likelihood that these standards would apply, and they have implications for setback, building height, and also massing, so that the kind of building envelope of your structure. Essentially, as it relates to setbacks, there's a formula or process you go through to show that you are kind of matching the setback, meaning how far the structure is from the street, with your neighbors. And so that could, in some cases, put you further back on a piece of property, or in some cases, bring you further up. So just something to be mindful of again. And then the last one are HOAs, deed restrictions, and restrictive covenants. So these are restrictions that can be placed on a property, and it's done through private means. And there's various forms of restrictions, as we'll get into. In many established neighborhoods, those are enforced by homeowners associations. But restrictive covenants also exist on older properties throughout the city as well, even those that might not have an active HOA. I want to make very clear that the city does not research, review, or enforce private covenants. And there's a possibility that a private covenant could contradict an allowance that the city may have. So a private covenant may say there's certain limitations on your property, even though the city would say you can build X, Y, Z. And so just something to keep in mind, that the city is not going to provide you any type of warning or heads up that there could be this restriction on the property. And here's some examples of actual deed restrictions. One banning all but single unit housing, another putting a minimum lot size requirement, which could hinder subdivision or the creation of smaller lots. We just want to note that older covenants do lack a clear process in terms of enforcement and how they could be changed. And recent case law has indicated that some covenants may have actually expired due to kind of lack of action to continue them. And our main point here is just for you all to make sure you're doing your research. Either individually, you can look through IMAPs and through the tax record and the Wake County Property Record website to try to find your deed if you don't already have it in hand. Or probably more advised is to seek professional assistance if it's not abundantly clear. Sometimes the exceptions to a clear title may not appear on your deed, and you can certainly start with your title insurance company, but you may need to dig even further and get an expert on board who can help kind of illuminate any potential restrictions that might be on your property. So we are going to now move into the planning and development review process. And so there are a whole host of folks who are involved in reviewing plans here at the city, many of which are in the room today. We have representation from a lot of these groups. But it is certainly a team effort. You'll sometimes hear reference to the matrix departments, and that's just the various trades and subject matter experts who help review your plan against the city's regulations. And so these are all the folks involved in the planning and development process. Before we dive into kind of tips and tricks for each of those trades, I want to just provide some terminology that you might hear. So these are how your projects might be classified. Subdivision, of course, the creation of new lots, divvying up of land. Administrative site review, or ASR, refers to that sort of initial entitlement for a project where you provide a plan and have it reviewed. And then site permit review may or may not be required depending on your project, but that essentially is kind of getting into the true permitting and land development stage for infrastructure, et cetera. Once you move beyond kind of the project phase, you'll likely start pulling permits. And so we have a number of different categories: residential, commercial, fairly self-explanatory, and then land, anything involving kind of the actual land development before you get to the construction of the building. And then also, of course, trades covering electrical, plumbing, mechanical, and then there are some miscellaneous permits that you might need to pull. One that might be common is fence, live work if you want to pursue that with your unit. So there is that other category as well. Generally speaking, when you go through the review process, you'll be categorized into one of three site plan tiers. And so we instituted this kind of hierarchy a few years ago. And essentially, there's tiers 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 is sort of the low-level projects, lower intensity projects. And so you can see those listed out: single-family homes, tiny homes, duplexes, 2-unit townhouses, ADUs. What's important to note here is that with a Tier 1, that there's the lowest level of expectation in terms of public improvements and compliance with our standards. So Tier 1s do not require you to dedicate right-of-way for the expansion of a road. They don't require tree preservation areas, amenity areas on site, transitions between your property and another property. So that's why they're really, Tier 1s are more reserved for those smaller scale projects, such as single family and duplex. If you're choosing to pursue a Tier 1 site plan, you'll go through the zoning review process. For single family and duplex, those are actually submitted through our permanent and development portal. Things to be mindful of, and I realize we're hammering this point, but really make sure you're aware of your base zoning district and also your overlay zoning, because that will have big implications for what you can do and what standards you'll be held to. Know your terminology, know what you're applying for. That helps, of course, both the reviewer and yourself. Make sure you can get through the process quickly. If terminology is confused on the documents, that will inevitably slow things down, which we don't want to happen. Also ensuring that your submittal documents are correct for the specific work type that you're applying for, which includes measurements. So a lot of what's involved with submitting a single-family home permit from a plan perspective is showing compliance with setbacks and other regulations. So the more detail you can provide to show compliance, the better, and that will just help expedite the process for you. Next, we'll move into site plan tiering, Tier 2. And this is really at the middle category. It's unlikely that a lot of projects will fall in here, but as you can see, it kind of covers those medium scale projects where there's a construction or addition between 4,000 and 10,000 square feet, or 10 and 25% of the existing building. So you could, small scale redevelopment, smaller townhouse and apartment projects could fall into this category. The main thing to be mindful of here is that right-of-way dedication and public improvements are still not required, except if your property is in a more urban area of the city. So if you are in our downtown, or if your property has an urban frontage, which is part of your zoning designation, then there will be a requirement for street trees and sidewalks. So that is a little unique about Tier 2. And then last, Tier 3 is essentially the catch-all category. If you are not explicitly a Tier 1 or Tier 2, you will fall into Tier 3. If you're doing a greenfield project or a brand new development on a site, with the exception of some of those Tier 1s, those more minor detached house, duplex, et cetera, but a larger project on a vacant site would be considered a Tier 3. And so this is really when all of the requirements that the city has would come into play, including right-of-way dedication and public improvements. Tips for getting through the site review process: with Tier 2 and 3, those applications are submitted to our customer service center. And the reviews are conducted by a team of staff. Once you get through that review process, there's going to be an approval document that you are provided with after all of any issues or outstanding comments are resolved. And a site permit review may be required. So site permit review is the combined submittal and review process that allows a development project to obtain all site approvals. Tier 1 site plans, so even those more minor projects, may be subject to the site permit review if there's a 12,000 square feet or more of land disturbance. So if you're moving a fair amount of dirt, the site permit review process could come into play. If there's an increase in impervious surface area resulting in stormwater treatment, or if there are public utility improvements. More information on the site review process can be found at that webpage linked at the bottom. And tips for subdivision review. So some of you may be pursuing a project where you want to divvy up land, and that would go through our subdivision process. Really, the tips here are very similar to the zoning review process. The base district, the overlay, the building type, and the development option will tell you what you need to know in terms of how large those lots can be, how many lots can be created in certain instances. Right now, pretty much all subdivisions that you would be pursuing would require right-of-way dedication. We don't have a minor subdivision process at the moment. So something to be mindful of is just what that expectation will be. If you want to pursue subdivision, the city likely will require some amount of right-of-way dedication. And just general tips for application acceptance and permit finalization. The city website and permit portal are your friend. So we do our best to host a lot of information on the city website. So we highly encourage you to check that out before contacting someone from the city, just so you can be fully briefed. We're, of course, more than happy to answer your questions, but a lot of information can be found there. The permit portal, as I said, handles a lot of our more minor permits, including some tier 1s. Again, important to make sure you have a complete application just for your benefit. All files need to be submitted in PDF format for us. That will just make sure we can move through quickly with your application. You'll be expected to provide contractor information, including license number and company name, certificate of insurance, and then sometimes performance bonds as well if those are required or needed. And then professionalism. We do our best to treat you with courtesy, to try and move through your application, move your application through as quickly as possible, and we just ask for that in return. It makes the whole process go much more smoothly. And there's a link at the bottom to the permit portal, and also we have, as you can see, a dedicated page to how to get a residential permit. That's something that we have for a lot of different review types. So again, the web page is a really, really great resource. And here is just an estimated timeline for reviews. For the most part, we do a great job of meeting our marks in terms of getting reviews turned around, but this is not exactly hard and fast, but just to give you a sense of how long it could take to get through that first round of review, depending on your project type, and then how much time it could take to get through additional rounds of review as well. So now I'm just going to jump into some of the specific trades. So first, we're going to start off with building code. Obviously, the building code is really expansive, so this is not meant to cover every single detail, but just some things to know for different building types that may trip folks up if they're not totally familiar. So with ADUs, be mindful that you're going to have independent egress, meaning access to that ADU. There also need to be a separate building drain connection to the building sewer, and a separate mechanical HVAC system for that ADU. So just some separate systems that need to be installed for the accessory dwelling unit to be mindful of. For tiny houses, in Raleigh anyways, there's going to need to be a permanent foundation for the location of that tiny house. If the tiny house is otherwise mobile, you really only have two options: either be constructed as a manufactured home or modular construction. So if you want it to be mobile at all, those are really the only two options per the North Carolina Department of Insurance. And then also the building code has a special provisions for smaller tiny houses, so 400 square feet or less in size. The building code was recently updated to include some provisions for those structures, which give a little bit more flexibility than a standard size home. For townhouses, there's no sprinkler requirement for townhouses if each of the units is separated by a fire-resistant wall per the North Carolina Residential Code. And essentially, they are evaluated like individual homes. Essentially, the code views those interior separation walls as property lines. So they get to play out of the residential code instead of the commercial code. Once you move into apartments, however, that is where you'll trip into the commercial code, and there'll be higher level of expectation. For instance, there are sprinkler requirements. There's minimum requirements related to size per the number of occupants, and then also expectations about what types of facilities are needed for each unit. So you can see those listed: closet, bathroom, kitchen sink, cooking appliance, and refrigerator. Now we'll move into transportation. The real critical thing to know about transportation just at the outset, because it could have big implications for the buildable area on your property, is our street plan. So the street plan basically maps all of our major streets and arterials, and that information can be found on iMaps as a separate layer. So if you're looking at your property, you can turn on the street plan, and essentially you match up that designation on the street plan to our Unified Development Ordinance, where you'll find information about what the cross-section that's required there the cross-section for that particular street, which gives you a sense of what types of facilities need to be provided and how much right-of-way you might be expected to dedicate. Some other things to be mindful of, especially in tight infill settings, are driveways. So we have requirements for driveway widths, spacing, how far driveways are from one another and at intersections, how far they are from adjoining properties, and then also how far back your driveway, how long your driveway needs to be, and how far back the entrance from any garage needs to be from the right-of-way. So these are really important references, again, particularly on smaller sites. City also maintains many different construction details pertaining to transportation and other groups, and so those can be found at that web link. Probably more relevant for contractors, but just something to certainly be mindful of. Next, we'll move into stormwater. So essentially, most projects fall into two categories. That's either exempt or traditional. So exempt comes with maximum impervious surface limitations, and so that just sets a strict percentage that you need to stay under unless you want to pursue alternative means of compliance. With traditional, the traditional requirements address water quality through nitrogen reduction and flooding through stormwater runoff controls. And so traditional does require an extensive set of calculations. You need to have a design professional. Exempt allows you to stay under just a percentage and can be a little bit easier for folks to comply with. Generally speaking, smaller or less intense projects, such as a single-family home with an ADU, are held to the exempt standards. Larger or more intense projects fall into the traditional stormwater compliance. So if you're dealing with, as you can see, under a half acre, regardless of the building type you pursue, you just need to be worried about that maximum impervious. Otherwise, you may trip into traditional stormwater compliance. So the easiest path is to just stay under that percentage, but if you want to go beyond that, there are options available. You can pursue a downstream flood analysis, and we definitely advise your professional to reach out to city stormwater staff. Also be aware this may not be available to you if there's not an appropriate analysis point to conduct that. There's also the option for volume control, and that requires a stormwater control measure designed for the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And then you can always opt into the traditional stormwater compliance as well, as sort of a third door for you all. And that involves, again, nutrient and peak discharge control calculations. There are changes coming to these regulations, some components that might be relevant to you all. We have grandfathered lot exemptions in our code. However, those will no longer apply when the lot is part of a common plan of development. So that could have impacts as to whether or not that maximum impervious applies. And then there's also changes to the nutrient analysis method for traditional stormwater compliance. And so that's something just more for your professional to be aware of. More information is at that webpage. Other rules to be mindful of, these are some that come up with small projects that can take builders by surprise. So downstream structural flooding, if this exists, additional analysis and maybe additional controls will apply. Definitely contact our stormwater group if you have questions. Watershed overlays, check IMAPs to see if an overlay applies. The overlays have firm impervious limits and more stringent stormwater control requirements. And then last, erosion and sediment control plans can be required for 12,000 square feet or greater of land disturbance and can apply to multiple lots in the same neighborhood. So that ESC plan must be prepared by a licensed professional. Sometimes surveyors will provide them for smaller sites. And there is a surety that's required at $100 per tenth of an acre. Next topic we'll cover quickly is urban forestry. So there's really three sets of tree type requirements to be aware of. The first is tree conservation. So this is an expectation for preserving trees on your site. It's only required for those tier 2 and tier 3 site plans if they are 2 acres or greater in size, and you can see the percentage requirements listed there. And similar to the open space that we talked about earlier, there is a ranking of primary and secondary areas. Watershed wooded areas apply within our watershed protection overlays. So this is, again, part of your zoning designation. If you reside in one of these overlay districts, there is this requirement to set aside 40% of your site as forested area. What's unique here is that that can be done either through preservation or planting, but there really aren't many exemptions as it relates to either your tier or your size. So this is something that comes into play or could come into play even with a small piece of property. So want you to be mindful. And then last are street trees. We talked about this earlier. This is essentially a public improvement. You'll be required to have street trees for all Tier 3 site plans and subdivisions. And it will be expected of you for Tier 1 and 2, again, if you're in a more urban context. And so that section of our UDO contains more information about placement. And then the city tree manual talks about types of trees, standards for the actual planting to direct your folks to. Two more sections. The next one being Raleigh water. So not a lot of thresholds, but just things to be aware of. One, does your lot have available access to public water and sewer? So luckily, this information is available in iMaps. Water is shown as a blue line. Sewer is shown in green. You can see how those are designated. Also want to be mindful if there are existing water and sewer taps. If they do exist, is your intent to utilize them or abandon them? You want to make sure too that all water meters and cleanouts for sewer on the site are accessible. If you're building an ADU, you can actually have that metered separately, or you can have it metered together with the primary dwelling. It's just something you'll want to be cognizant of as you're pursuing an ADU project. And then certain projects, when it comes to Raleigh Water's review, might require a downstream sewer analysis. So more than 100 units, which probably most folks aren't pursuing, but also if there's existing capacity limitations, you could be required to produce a downstream sewer analysis. For more information, if you have specific questions, feel free to contact our water review group at that email. And then last, fire. These are really important because really apply to pretty much every project. If you have more than 2 R3 units, which is essentially just a detached house, single-family home, you're going to be required to make sure there's access by a 20-foot wide fire access road with a 28-foot inside turning radius, and gravel is not permitted. So in a lot of cases, the road itself will provide that fire access to your property or structure. But if you're looking to do a structure that's set back significantly from the road or multiple structures, that's where this could come into play. And essentially, it's to make sure that there is space for our apparatus to properly fight a fire. And then all parts of the structure need to be within 150 feet from that access road as a fire hose lays. So that ensures that they can adequately fight the fire around the structure. And there's really no leniency there, so it's just something to be mindful of. If you can't meet that 150-foot mark from the road, that's where that fire access would need to be provided so they can bring the apparatus closer to your unit. Also need to make sure there's a fire hydrant within 600 feet, and a fire flow analysis will also be required. So that concludes the presentation. I realize I covered a lot of ground there, but hopefully it was useful and can kind of give you all a sense for where to look for more information. I did want to note that we have a lot of the professionals in the room today for those different subject areas. So if you have a very specific question, there'll be an opportunity during the roundtable discussions. I think right now, depending on timing, we may shift over to break. Is there enough time for any questions? Okay, yeah, we can take a few questions. I will ask any of the folks in the room that are related to one of the trades that may come to you for an answer. I'm not going to answer all the questions, but if there's a zoning one, I'm happy to do it. And Katie can walk around to provide folks with a microphone if anyone wants to ask a question now.
You can raise your hand. Okay, great. Okay.
Thanks so much. Very helpful. A couple quick things. On the affordable requirement for apartments, was that just the number of units past the initial first 12?
Yes, so that would come into play if you had a project with more than 12 units. So once you go to 13, there would still be a requirement for a minimum of 1 unit to be affordable. Yeah. But past that, you'd base it on a percentage, so 20% of the units over 12. So if you stay under, if your project is 12 or under, there's no specific affordability requirement for that particular option.
Gotcha. And then with sprinklers on apartments, is that starting with 3 units and up? There's going to be a sprinkler requirement?
So I'll probably defer to Jason if he's in the room. Yeah, Jason, do you mind just responding to that? Yeah, so the question was, is there a sprinkler requirement for 3-unit and up apartments always? And whether or not that will always come into play?
So currently, the 3 units attached would have to be designed under the North Carolina Building Code, not the residential code. That's helpful. So currently, 3 units or more that are attached have to be designed under the North Carolina Building Code rather than the residential code. And typically, when you get to the building code, residential occupancies do have sprinkler requirements. However, there is an exemption for R3s, so it matters how your occupancy is classified. So if it's a triplex, there is an exemption in the building code that allows you not to sprinkle that if you meet other certain criteria. So if it's an R3 type project, you can, even though there's other design elements from the building code that are required, sprinkler systems have an exception for 3 and 4 units, which would be tris and quads. Even though you're designing out of the building code, you do have an exception in there for that. There's legislation right now that's moving through that may change a lot of those things, but we won't speculate on how that may progress. But as it stands currently, you do go to the commercial code, however, you do have an exemption. And I don't know who asked the question, but does that help?
It was over here. You did
Okay.
it. Great job. Thanks, Jason. We have time for just a couple more questions. All right, right here. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you clarify a little bit on the flag lot? When you subdivide the flag out, you said that you would build an ADU back there, but can you sell that? So then it's not an ADU, it's more of a tiny house?
Yes, yes, so you're correct. With the flag lot option, essentially the only type of unit that can be constructed on a flag lot is what our code terms a tiny house. So very similar to an ADU, although tiny houses can be a little bit larger. And you are correct that under our code, tiny houses are considered a principal dwelling, don't need to be associated with any other building on the lot. And for that reason, they can be sold separately. So the unit and the land underneath can be transferred. And that was the principal motivation behind creating that option, is just understanding a lot of folks, either for financing purposes or their own motivations to sell, want to be able to subdivide off land underneath what would otherwise be an ADU. But again, once you subdivide it, it's called a tiny house on a flag lot.
Okay. And then this is maybe another kettle of fish, but can any of this kind of be applied to like land trusts arrangements?
Any of these development options?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the city does not regulate ownership. So if someone wanted to pursue a unique form of ownership for a particular property, that's not something that the city would regulate or interfere with. So yes, I mean, there are options that could exist for land trusts or land condos or that type of thing. And there wouldn't be any explicit prohibition under the city's regulations.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's maybe one more question over here. Okay, great.
Hey, thank you. I was going to ask if the city has contemplated with these duplexes and in frequent transit areas, making those individual duplex units fee simple. Is that something?
Yeah, so essentially, despite the name difference, duplexes and 2-unit townhouses basically treated exactly the same. So anywhere, for the most part, where you can construct a duplex, you could construct a 2-unit townhouse, which would enable that fee simple arrangement that you're talking about. So that would apply in those frequent transit areas, but also in other areas throughout the city. The only district that we don't permit duplexes in today is R1, which is our least dense area of the city, probably not where most folks are looking anyways. But otherwise, in our residential 2 through residential 10 districts, duplexes are permitted, as well as 2-unit townhouses.
All right, I think that does it for questions. We're going to take a break, about a 20-minute break, and then come back and start our panel.
Thanks to Keegan for an excellent presentation. Like he said, I know that's a lot of information, but it's a great foundation for a lot of the conversation we're going to have later today and then right now. We have a panel of, I was reminded at the break that we have a room full of expertise in this subject matter area, and I want to make a commitment that we'll continue to try to get this group together and have additional engagements so that we can continue to listen to the struggles, the challenges, and the opportunities you all are finding as we work together to increase the amount of small-scale development here in Raleigh. But we have a panel here today that is full of what I consider to be the greatest thought leaders and practice leaders in small-scale development Raleigh and regionally. I'm going to very briefly introduce them. Their full bios are on the back of your agendas. And we will have, I have some guided questions to get the conversation started, and then we'll let the panelists provide some comments and have time for questions from you all. So first with us today, we have Tom Barrie. Tom is a professor of architecture at NC State University and has architect and has built a ADU for his private use. So really, it makes him that alone makes him an expert. But he all has additional professional expertise to go along with that. We also have Jess Brandis. Jess is a senior director of real estate development at CASA, which is a nonprofit organization that provides affordable housing in our region very successfully and very creatively. Tiffany Elder is a small-scale developer, a realtor and contractor from Durham, owner of Paradigm Properties, who's done private market, affordable, and accessible housing throughout the region. And we also have Jonathan Hand. One of the biggest issues we confront is financing in small-scale development, and we're really glad to have Jonathan, who's with a senior vice president at North State Bank, to talk a little bit about how we can position what products are available and how we can position small-scale development to successfully get financing. And last but not least, Topher Thomas is the founder of Coram Homes, Coram Houses. Topher is a chemistry teacher, but he has a passion for helping his community and saw the need for small-scale development in Durham and started Coram Houses as a way to try to find creative ways to get ADUs built in Durham, and has an incredible story. So welcome to our panel. All right, so I was talking to Jess at the break, and our first question is for the panel is, what are some insights you all would like to share about how to break into small-scale development with a particular focus on the two of the most challenging areas, regulatory barriers and accessing capital? So who wants to start? You all have microphones there in front of you.
So, and this might be a little scattered, sort of the first piece of advice that I would give to individuals who have not dove in yet is to try to find a project that you can do by right. Try to find a project that has all the entitlements you need, sort of get that win under your belt so that you can show success, and then build from there. The good thing is, City of Raleigh and some of the surrounding cities do have sort of allowances in the zoning codes that let you do more creative things now, so leverage those. Because when it comes to your financing, when it comes to getting your approvals for permitting, et cetera, it's easier, it's an easier, or it's not a fight if you're doing something within what's allowed. And again, building that record of success that you can build on and get more creative and grow into more creative and more dynamic projects down the line. So try to find something that you can do within current entitlements.
I'll chime in. And I'll just chime in with a story of where I didn't follow the regulations in the code, which was my first building project. And it was 4 years ago now, but in Durham, there's a rule that you can build a 12 by 12 structure with no permits. And I was trying to, find an easy way in to do something. I don't know if you guys know what teachers make, but it's a very small amount of money. And so I needed a way to make some extra money, and I thought having a small house in the backyard, I didn't even know the word ADU yet, but I thought if I had a small little house back there, I could rent it out and make some extra money. And so I built it out of just recycled materials that I was collecting from construction waste. And I started renting it out. Rented it out for 3 months. It was incredible. I was so surprised. It was 90 square feet My dad's in the back. He was like, nobody's gonna live in your silly little house in the backyard. And it was rented out, no problems, no vacancies, until my neighbor called the city and was like, hey, this guy has a house that he's renting out in the backyard. I don't think it's legal. And she was right. It was illegal. But then the next process, the next part of the story, COVID hits. I begin tearing it down, and I begin to develop a relationship with the inspection department, with the folks who do permitting, right? And they were so kind, so gracious, so helpful, right? They guided me to what's called the UDO, which we heard a lot about a UDO. And I was like, oh, there's a UDO. I read through the UDO. And so take advantage of the folks who work from the city. You know, don't take too much advantage, but they are there, they're compensated to be there to help us do good development, right? And so they helped me a ton when I first started, right? And I was able to get so much guidance and help as, you know, a 27-year-old trying to figure this thing out. So, you know, echoing what Tiffany said, find something that's manageable and doable, right? Which I was like, this little tiny house, 100 square foot house, that's easy, that's simple. And then utilizing the folks who are going to be reviewing your project, right? You want to have a good relationship with them, and you want to, you know, we're a team working on this together. And so utilize what they're doing. Don't try to circumvent, because that ends poorly, and there are big fines when you do that. So that's what I'll say.
Can I just add one thing? Just to echo that, I think thinking through that, especially from the planning staff, you know, planning staff works for all these years to create these comprehensive plans, zone things the way they want, and then they need developers to make it a reality. So, you know, just coming into the process with the mindset of like, I'm fulfilling the vision that these folks want to create, can just, if you're intimidated by the process, if you know, are embarrassed to ask a stupid question, like they need everyone in this room to be doing the work, to be getting the units on the ground. And I've been doing this for 15 years. I ask idiotic questions every single day. I call people and just say, what is this document? Who signs this thing? And they're just very, very helpful, you know, and you just keep asking and keep learning and keep doing what they tell you to do next until you're done.
And just a piece of kind of very basic recommendations coming from the professor is if you have time, do your research, find best practices and examples of success.
I think what I would add is to do projects within your respective capitalization levels. We see a lot of great projects, but unfortunately, the applicants that come to us don't have the financial wherewithal to make the project work. And so kind of get an understanding of kind of where you stand from a capitalization perspective before you start a project would be some of the advice that I would give to you as well. Obviously, it depends if you're looking at a for-sale project or a rental project. As a rule of thumb, I always tell folks that you need roughly 20% of the cost of the project in liquidity because the bank's not going to finance 100% of your project. So that 20% covers the equity contribution that you're going to be required into a project as well as some interest carry should that project sit.
Jonathan, that's a great jump-off point to our next question, which is, what are some successful examples or precedents that have been funded in conventional, traditional ways through residential or commercial lenders locally? Why don't we start with you as a lender? What you just talked a little bit about some keys to success. Are there some projects or examples you can point to of small-scale development that you consider successful? And then the rest of the panel, if you want to speak about your experiences in getting financing.
Banking is very boring. We look for things that really kind of just fit within a box. And understanding kind of what those box parameters are for your respective project's important. So kind of coming in with, hey, this is how my banker is going to think with respect to this project. The other kind of advice that I would add to that is, you know, have your project be commensurate to the bank that you're talking to. You know, larger banks are probably not going to be interested in a little single-family project that you're doing, whereas a community bank is not going to be interested in a mega, you know, 500 neighborhood subdivision. Tons of great success stories out there with respect to projects throughout the community. None that really kind of come to mind, but again, I think it's just important that you're bringing a project that kind of fits within the parameters of what a bank is looking for.
If I can add to that, one thing that really helped me when I was getting started in first building banking relationships was if I was driving around and I saw a project that was similar to what I wanted to do or what I was currently doing or a project that I had envisioned for the next time, don't be too proud to ask, hey, who's financing this? Don't be, take the time to dig in the records and find out what lending institution has a lien, because that shows they have an appetite for that type of loan. Then, make a list and keep that in your back pocket. You want to get your lending relationships solidified before you need them. You want to find out who's lending, even though banking appetites change, like the type of loans they want to make, their portfolios change, and that can change over time, but find out who's financing what you want to do.
And most of the time, the bank is going to be proud and put a sign in front of a project.
Thanks for those additionally great insights. Thank you. Next question is, how can small developers and nonprofits work with larger real estate developers, or can they? And if so, how can they do so to build more affordable housing? Again, as we talked about earlier, large developers are a big part of the ecosystem. Is there a way to partner or leverage that work?
So, small developers have their finger on the pulse of their communities. They know what's going on. They have relationships within the communities. Sometimes larger developers who are focused on the big things to keep those big projects going don't necessarily have that. So I'll use an example currently. I'm currently working, I'm a small developer in the community. I'm working with a large developer. One, we're renovating a 20-unit apartment complex, and we're going to make those units available to teachers and first responders, ideally, so missing middle housing in our community. Also working with that same larger developer on an 84-unit low-income housing tax credit project. My contribution ties to the community and helping them understand what the community needs and making sure that those things are woven into the project, because those are the things that they don't have time to focus on. So any type of partnership is really about figuring out who's good at what and figuring out how you can help to fill the gap for someone who has capacity to do more than you, but doesn't have the expertise in the area that you have, and you filling that gap for them. So I would say that that's one way that smaller guys can partner with the larger guys and create better projects, and help to sort of move the smaller guys, in the community sort of through the pipeline, so that eventually we can, partner with the future smaller guys and sort of keep that pipeline going.
If I can chime in, just a very similar story where understanding what both of those parties, small-scale developers, large-scale developers, bring to the table. Like, I only focus on, all I've built are things under 500 square feet. So I stay in a very small range of size. But I'm partnering with a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate firm to build an 18-unit tiny home community development, right? And what they bring to the table is a name, bank relationships, the 20% down that Jonathan requires to get that loan. I don't have that money, but they do, right? And I have this connection, as Tiffany mentioned, to the community, my pulse on what we're doing. I understand. I know the neighborhood names. I know my neighbors' names. And that commercial real estate firm, they're not even nearby, but they're able to bankroll the project, see the vision, understand it, and leverage also the human power that they have, because they have construction crews, they have all these different things, and they can leverage all of that and the banking relationships to make the project happen, things that I could not make happen on my own. And I think that's just like a broader idea in general of just community IQ, community power is much more powerful than what we can do on our own. So never being afraid to go out and ask for help. I know that I would not have constructed my future ADUs were it not for people, because I still don't have 20% down. I'm going around and I'm asking people, hey, this is the story, and do you want to be a part of that story? And if people say yes, then they can contribute, we can all come together, and we can make that happen. And so, just really diving into that team effort that's required to build communities. So,
Yeah, and I'll kind of jump on that. We do see a lot of investors coming in and supporting smaller builders, trying to get started, developers, those sort of things. And that is something that can be financed, again, if you bring in the right firepower to back you for a project. And it's a great way for a builder, developer to kind of piggyback. So yes, there may be some sort of profit split, But again, something is better than nothing, and that's how you build your business going forward.
And if I can just bounce right off that, Jonathan, something I'm learning a lot is mitigation of risk. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but banks want to mitigate their risk. And so having somebody who's had successful projects, if you're trying something creative and new, if somebody who has built things, maybe it's not the thing you want to build, but they've built things and they've had successful projects, a bank's going to be more willing if that person's partnered with you on this new project.
That's correct.
Can I just say one more thing about that?
Please.
I think, when I meet, I think what's helpful for me is to keep in mind that, like, everybody who's doing development, we're all kind of dealing with the same problems and we're all facing the same challenges. I mean, if you're doing a little project or you're doing a huge project, your cost probably went up by 70% in the last 2 years, and everyone's sort of suffering through that. When I meet, if you're like a big time, developer, they're also trying to solve the same problems. I mean, they're seeing people at the intersections, asking for money. They're seeing income inequality in our communities. They're seeing displacement too, and they're like wanting to know how to solve that. So I think just coming to it with this mindset of like, we're all members of the same community, and like you guys said, like what can we bring, and I'm thinking, just about, now I'm just spitballing, but the inclusion of greater than 12 units is going to require that 60% AMI and below permanent affordability for 30 years. That can sound intimidating to like a big developer. They're like, whoa, deed restricted permanent affordability for 30 years. That's not exactly our deal. Maybe that's an opportunity there for a partner to come in locally who's like, well, we can manage that for you. We can put that in place. Here's the value we can add. We can fill those units. We can qualify all of those renters for you. Here's how we can bring that skill set to the table and form a partnership to create that. So looking at those ways of what are the values that we have as smaller developers or nonprofit developers working in the affordable space that these other firms kind of just don't have that specialization.
Thanks, Jess. Maybe you can start us off on our next question too, which is we've heard a lot about, we heard from Jonathan about the need to keep a close eye on costs and on the scope to make sure that it meets the lending profile. What are some of the best ways to manage costs and keep them down while building smaller scale development?
Good luck.
I'm asking you the tough one. And then anybody else who wants to weigh in. Well, I think it's more important than ever, right, because of the acceleration in costs.
Yeah, I mean, I was chatting with people at my table. We had a project we thought was ready to go last spring, got real bids coming in, and had to do some serious value engineering, had to reduce the square footage, had to just simplify the building. Learned a lot in that process about just like what is driving cost, it's grading, it's, how can we get the site as sort of simple as possible. For us, it was everything's on the table conversation. We ended up switching all of the one bedrooms to studios. Just removing some of that was decreasing our carpentry line item. We had a basement that we sort of didn't really need. And so we were like, can we just create egress from that lower level in a different way without having to go all the way down there and have that, subgrade that was driving up grading, it was driving up our concrete costs. We just bought, there was a parcel on a small project that we're doing. We had this massive engineered retaining wall that was just costing a fortune. And the next door neighbor's parcel, he's like, I'll sell it to you for $20,000. And this retaining wall was going to cost $70,000. And if we could buy the parcel, we could just grade on it instead of using the retaining wall. So, I'm going to my CEO, hey, we're going to buy this $20,000 parcel that we can't build anything on. But don't worry, it's going to save us money. So really just, and that was my staff member was out on the site and said, do we have to build this retaining wall? And it hadn't occurred to our GC or our engineer. So I think really put everything out there on the table, think outside the box. There's never a dumb question. Do we really need that? Is this really bringing value to the project? Are all part of the value engineering process I've gone through.
I can add to that. I mean, because some of the issues you raise are design issues. And, those of you who are developing housing want to keep your costs within your budget, but you want to design something that's beautiful, that uplifts the spirit of people who live there, and if you're selling it, of course, it is attractive to buyers. So there's a lot of things you can talk about when it comes to design issues. What I often talk to my students about is make it square footage poor, but spatially rich. And that's just a design issue. Use conventional materials and assemblies, but use them in inventive ways. Window packages are always a big part of a budget. Be very strategic with windows and their placement. So there's a long list we can go through. That's a kind of teaser.
So just to kind of touch on costs, we obviously see it on the construction side of that. 4 years ago, it probably took 6 months to build a house. Now it's about 15 months. So the velocity is not there that it used to be. And so when you have a 15-month period of time to build a house, you're much more susceptible to changes in cost. We saw that during COVID lumber. I think everybody knows kind of what transpired there. That kind of gets back again to the financing piece of this, is why we look for that proper capitalization, because again, if our velocity is slowed down, we want to make sure that there's going to be funds available to you in the event of some sort of spike in some sort of material cost, windows, lumber, whatever the rising cost of the week is at this point in time. The other thing that I want to mention, and I think it was mentioned about changing scope and size of things. That's great and innovative. The challenge becomes, does that change your financing arrangement? And so if the bank was expecting and appraised the house at 1,500 square feet and now you're at 1,200 square feet, does that change the banking structure, and does that cause any type of concern for the bank? So just kind of keep that in mind, that yes, it's great to kind of think outside of the box, but make sure that you're including your lender in that thought conversation.
And I'll just add, and I think this is coming out of what everybody's saying, is thoughtful planning with a beginner's mind, going back to what Jess was saying, of like everything being on the table, but having all of those conversations, because what I'm finding costs a lot of money is when you start something and then you decide, oh, I need to change from this to that mid-project, right? And then everything is delayed. So then there's the cost of the change itself, and then there's the cost of sourcing the new item that you want to bring in, making sure your subs are going to be there to install it when it needs to be installed, and that delays everybody, right? And so really good planning and not starting the project until it's fully planned. And I am prone to building the plane as I'm already flying the plane. So this is something that I'm already prone to doing. And so I'm learning this as I do it, the importance of really good planning and being very selective. Right? I appreciate the, square foot small, but space big. I can't remember your exact words, but something like that is what it sounded like.
That's good.
And thank you. But I try to do that. I build 500 square foot or below. And so I try really hard to create as open, as bright of spaces as I can, and do so in the most cost-efficient way as possible, because my whole goal is for it to be rented well below market rate naturally, right? Without any subsidies or anything else, just to be that. So it just takes very careful, selective planning and the recognition that everything doesn't need to be top of line, right? It's okay to go with mid-range things and do that, right? They're gonna be acceptable. For me, I spend most of the time in my house in this yellow chair that's in like a 10 square foot nook in my house. That's why I do my reading. That's why I do a lot of my thinking. That's it. I could live in that little space. We don't need as much as we think. And so being able to distill down is really important. And talking to people about what it is that they want and need, and then focusing in on those things. And that keeps costs down.
Thanks, y'all. So Topher, why don't you start us off, and then y'all work back towards me. I'd like to hear from each of you on this one. What is the biggest challenge you confronted, and then the biggest kind of happy surprise or opportunity from your most recent project? And then also, same two things going forward, right? What do you see on the horizon? Of course, very uncertain, but over the next 2 or 3 years.
I think the biggest challenge is often working with, no offense to cities and stuff, but the process portion, getting to that stage. And it seems like y'all in Raleigh are doing a way better job than in Durham. Apologies, there are Durham folks in the room who I'm planning, but it takes me about 3 months to get a permit, right? Initial review will be about 20 days, and then re-review can take anywhere from 30 to 60 days. And so there's this really long time, and I'm a pesterer, so I'm just sending emails, and they're like, stop bothering us, please. And well, we'll get to it when we get to it. So that can be kind of draining. And then also working with, Duke Energy to get, to get power and those different things. So working with like the larger institutions to get those like very basic things. Like we just finished a house and we got our certificate of occupancy. Duke Energy hasn't powered the house yet. And, this morning on my way in, I was calling, I was like, hey, when are you guys gonna get the meter out there? We have a family waiting to move in. They have a baby, they need power, so can we do that? So those kinds of things, like, we'll get to it when we'll get to it. And I'm like, great, and that's out of my hands. So I think what I'm trying to say is the things that are out of my control are difficult. Now, in terms of joys, so using that same ADU as an example, we had an open house and about, I think, 150 or so people rolled through, and there was a lot of just excitement and joy about, oh, like, this is possible. I could do this in my own backyard. A lot of people from the neighborhood came out, and they were like, I want to do this. When can you stop by my backyard? When can we do this? And that's been, over the 18 months or so that I've been doing Coram, that's been very, that's happened a lot. Right, I've been very happily surprised by the response. And I did not expect for people to be so willing to share their land and their yard. And that's excited me. You talked about covenants a little bit. And if y'all have read like Color of Law or Race for Profit, you know the history, if you've read those books, of racism and racial covenants and redlining and just the entire framework of like money and capital in America. But seeing people have this shift that the land is for all of us to share. And I know I am the property owner, but I would love to share some of my backyard that I'm not using with a neighbor, right? And people wanting and getting that has been really, really cool. So I have the huge pipeline, and I'm trying to be careful to like not grow too fast, because I thought I was gonna do like, 1 and then 3, and now I'm like, oh, I got 25 contracts, I don't know what I'm about to do. And so trying to learn how to do that well. But I've been so pleasantly surprised by how affirming and excited people are to partake. And you mentioned, too, in the talk that single-family homes are what's most popular. So imagine an ADU in every backyard and what that would do to all of us to be sharing our land with other people, right? It would change the ethos of the city, right? It becomes a different place, a more communal and shared place. And that, to me, is the most exciting thing about what I get to do.
So I get to follow that. I think just a couple of things that I would just say is you need to have a personal relationship with your banker. If you don't know your banker's name and you're calling a 1-800-WHO-CARES number, you're not going to get very far. So have a personal relationship with your banker so that you can talk through things. I mentioned kind of a box, and our industry is regulated. We do have a box. But I think probably one of the greatest things that having a personal relationship with a banker is going to enable you to do is take all the random puzzle pieces that are associated with your project and figure out how to put them into the box. And again, you can't do that if you don't have a personal relationship with a banker. From a joy perspective, home building, development is a wonderful industry. Not only does it provide for our families, but if you think about how it achieves the American dream for most folks out there. For me, just building houses and going down the street and saying, I financed that house, and seeing kids playing in the front yard. I mean, that's what's so satisfying, and that's what motivates me every day to get up and do what I do, again, to help families meet the American dream.
Speaking of challenges, I'll speak to a project working on now, building 3 what are called small homes in Durham near Central. And the challenge that small developers like myself will face are the market changes. Like, that's something we don't control. Like Topher said, those are some of the challenges. Duke Energy on this project, permitting on this project, took quite a bit longer than expected. And in the meantime, we all know of interest rate changes, et cetera, and those things sort of push potential values down, and then you get to a point where you're like, is this project going to work? So those are some of the challenges. Plus side on that one is from the time we priced the framing package to the time we ordered the framing package dropped over $12,000. So that gave us a little bit of savings. So, those unknowns, being ready to sort of dip and move to balance things out because again, those unknowns you don't control. In the end, the goal is to get good product on the ground and get it on the ground affordably so that you can create more homeownership and more housing opportunities. And, you know, if you have tenacity and you're willing to stick with it, that's what you're gonna do, and leverage your you know, colleagues and your relationships to get that done. So that's definitely the plus side, and the upside is seeing the end to your efforts every time you do it.
Yeah, the last 2 years have been really challenging. I mean, for a gazillion reasons, I'm sure for everybody in this room. And, you know, the cost increase has just been shocking, you know, the amount we've had to kind of overcome in terms of just dollar increases and cash we've needed to go find. I mean, our banking relationships have been key, just getting on the phone with that banker who you definitely know and say, we're going to need another $1 million added to the loan. Is that cool? And I think that's kind of the new normal. I mean, looking a little bit into the future, I think these new numbers are the new normal. And with the cost per square foot, the cost per unit, you know, if we really want to do downtown development, the land cost is kind of like, these are real numbers. So some of the challenges I look for out in the next 2 years is just easing into that new normal, high interest rates, just extremely high land cost. We work in the affordable space, so we rely a lot on things like bonds, like affordable housing bonds. Raleigh passed one, Durham passed one. Durham's money's all been spent. So we're sort of like, Durham needs to issue a new bond so we can keep building there. And the equity that needs to go into these deals is just getting more and more onerous. And so I think, you know, I have a lot of uncertainty about where those dollars are going to come from, because the federal government and stuff has sort of just been sticking to their formula while prices have just been going up so much. But, you know, I mean, talking about the joy, we've got a project we're COing today. It's in Chapel Hill and Carborough. I've been working on it since 2016. We're going to have, you know, families who are sleeping in their cars this weekend moving into apartments on Monday. And it is just like, I mean, nothing beats that. And, you know, I've met so many great people in 6 years, our contractors, and even, you know, the staff and all the people that we work with. I mean, it's such a joyful, fun, it's like planning a big party that takes years and things keep going wrong, but you're all just like really excited about this surprise party you're going to throw at the end. So, I mean, it's just joyful work, so.
Okay, so Patrick mentioned that I'm currently building an accessory dwelling unit at my house in Raleigh, and I can share also that I was part of a group of people who led the efforts to get ADUs legalized in Raleigh. Jen Truman's here. She was part of these efforts, all 7 years. That's right. We were very patient. All to just say that my heart has really been in this, and you know, in terms of how do we share, right, what we have, and how do we really start to change through demonstration projects the enculturation of the single-family house, what some people have described as the stranglehold of the single-family house, and all the good reasons, I won't go through them, many of you know them, why we need to change our culture around housing. So the challenge of doing my ADU, and Patrick and I have talked about this, is I took it through permitting, because I said, so what's this like? Usually architects, or certainly owners, will rely on their contractor to take it through permitting, but I did it. And I discovered, as I'm finding with code issues too, that for ADUs, micro units, you know, I'll lump them all together, is that the code doesn't make distinctions between those types of housing and single-family houses. And so the requirements that I was subject to, that everybody was subject to with ADUs, were, in my opinion, and were greatly exceeded what a small, in my case, a 360 square foot unit, that 300 of which is actually the living space. So this is a small unit, and I think the city of Raleigh, I mean, I know you're working on it. Many cities across the country are working on on just that kind of issue of permitting, because they're discovering they've got the legislation, but they're not getting the units built. And there's a lot of emerging literature out on that. City of Raleigh has got some pre-approved ADU units now. That's a good step in the right direction, but we actually need a fast-track permitting process. You all know the kind of decision-making trees, right? If you are below 500 square feet, skip these 2 steps. If this, skip that step. In other words, that's a way to actually incentivize certain things and also streamline the process. So there's lots of work that we can continue to do here in Raleigh, and then we can also look nationally to that as well. And just so you know, there's a recent study that's come out, the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at the University of Berkeley has come out with a very, I think, solid study based on the fact that missing middle housing is not getting built at the rates that we would all like it to be. And they have some very specific recommendations on how to do that. And that's more across the board. So the joy of this is that Joel LaBelle is here with Armature Design Build. And Joel is a contractor on our project. We're having a lot of fun, even when we're solving problems, because we both have a perverse love, I think, of solving difficult problems. And it's getting built, and it's living up, certainly up to my expectations. And my wife and I, before we built this, decided what we were going to do with it. First of all, we're going to give it away. We're going to give it to friends, family, friends of friends, visiting faculty from NC State. We also have plans to participate in the NC State homestay program. We have very high rates of students at NC State who have experienced homelessness within within a year period, which is where we do our kind of survey work. And so we're going to provide that kind of transitional housing for students, and ultimately it will be an affordable unit on the market after we sort of take it through its steps.
Thank you all so much for those. Those were really thoughtful and inspiring. Last question from me, and then we'll see if we have a few minutes for folks to ask questions of you from the audience. You heard from Keegan about the efforts that the city of Raleigh has made to change its rule book or unified development ordinance to make small-scale housing more achievable. There still remain, of course, a lot of impediments. We talked about that, and we'll talk about that some more going forward. But one of the key changes that was made was to make most of this, as Tiffany called it, by right, meaning if you have the meet all the rules that council adopted, staff can review it and approve it without an explicit or formal public process. The intent of that was to reduce the time, cost, and uncertainty that goes with development, which really ends up leading to less development. But there's, of course, been a lot of political debate about whether that's a good idea or not. So I'd like to hear from you all about your insights on that. How important is it? And then, assuming it stays like it is, where a lot of this is by right, what are ways that you all can work voluntarily with neighbors to make sure neighbors feel like this is adding and contributing to their community rather than something that's negative or a concern?
So change sometimes makes people uncomfortable. That's a reality. And within every community, you have individuals who want to see change in this direction, and then you have folks who want to see change in this direction. And that's where some of the challenges come in. How do we come together and find whatever commonalities we have so that we can agree on those and move forward? Having options to build by right is really the only way to see our cities grow in the way that we need them to grow. We all drive around and we see these huge skyrise and other, really cool projects, and our cities need those. But in reality, infill projects are the projects that build out our city. Those are not the projects that the big guys want to have a hand in. Those are the projects that everyone in this room can take a part in, but those are the projects that need sort of a little tug or a little push, and need to be able to be done by right in order for them to be able to be done, because of their smaller nature, and because of the cost and the time that's involved. So again, everyone in this room, I'm sure you love the city and the communities in which you live. And these are the reasons why it's important to have as many by right options, but you have to balance that with, sometimes there's a concern from, certain individuals or groups in the community that if you allow too much to be by right, you don't have control over what's being built in your community. They feel like all the reins have been taken off, and they'll fight it tooth and nail to keep you from being able to have that by right option. And really that's that's a teachable moment. That's an opportunity for those of you who understand the changes that are being requested to explain, to your neighbors, and to sort of reach over the yard and explain to them why it's needed and what's needed, so that you can take some of that fear away. Because again, these projects are not going to be done by individuals like us in this room if a lot of the barriers to enter into those projects remain as high as they are. So I applaud Raleigh, I applaud Durham, I applaud all the municipalities who've taken steps to make these things a little easier to do. You drive around the city and you see small homes being built. You see ADUs starting to pop up. It's nowhere near the pace that we need them. Like Topher, I would love to see every home here, or as many homes as homeowners feel is necessary to have an ADU in the yard, whether it's for families who are aging in place and need somewhere to live, whether it's providing housing to whatever demographic needs housing. Because our cities are growing and we need more of that. So I would say, reach across the fence and create more teachable moments. Educate yourselves on what these changes mean, understand what they mean, and try to teach the next person, so that fear that just inherently comes along with, wait, this is changing and you're taking away our right to speak against it or to give our input, so that you can take that fear away, and so that everyone's comfortable with the direction of growth in our communities.
Well, I can talk about this. I mean, I think, in some ways this is, I consider to be one of the more important questions, because we see the phenomenon of neighborhoods, of our fellow citizens fighting changes like this, particularly by right. This fear that they're going to lose control of their communities and so forth. And with that, I just want to say, folks, we're losing control globally here, right? Let's keep our eye on the big picture here. So as an educator, I mean, what I've really dedicated at least part of my work at NC State to is just doing my little bit, right, to provide resources and educational platforms to try to change the culture around diversifying our housing. So there are some ways that one can work at the community level. First of all, realize that some people aren't going to be convinced. They're just not. And the best thing we can do is help the culture just to move around or through them. The second thing is, sorry. The second thing is that we can make it personal, right? Tell personal stories, tell our own stories, tell stories of our neighbors. I tell the story of, I moved to Raleigh 20 years ago. We moved next to a fourplex. We've known most of our neighbors who rent there over the 20 years. And been privileged to do that, and know that it has offered below market rate units that entire time. Right? These are the kind of stories we need to tell. When we were advocating for ADUs, we had tours. We said, well, ADUs have been here for ages. Look at these, these aren't ruining the neighborhood, right, and so forth. So make it local. And then the other thing is national examples can help too. It's the old, everybody's doing it, Why aren't we? Because, you know, there is a certain part of human nature that says, I want to get on board what everybody else is doing, paradoxically. Right? So we can do that. And then there's the overall compelling reasons. And these are harder arguments to make at a neighborhood level, but there's clearly very compelling reasons why we need to diversify our housing stock. And understanding how we got to this place this spot in the first place. Climate change. Need I say more? Raleigh's a very low density city, and it has proven, there's lots of literature out there that dense cities are sustainable cities. There's affordable housing. There is research, you know, this is really more emerging research, but there is emerging research saying that if you simply build more housing, if you're building more diverse housing, it doesn't happen right away, but eventually you get more of a diversity of price points. So we need to make use of that kind of research and make sure that people understand that we are actually understanding how this works. When it comes to zoning reform, we have to honestly face the history of zoning and its role in racial and economic discrimination, right? The Color of Law, of course, is a brilliant book that I think has helped a lot of people understand that. And then there's also health and well-being. You know, what's more important than your health? If cozy, compact neighborhoods are walkable, they support public transit, and so forth. So these are the larger arguments, but I think ones that we just have to keep hammering away at if we're going to change the culture out there and make, you know, make Raleigh a true 21st century city.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks everybody for those great insights and the great conversation. Let's hear it for our panel. Yeah. I think we probably have time for one or two questions, and then we'll go on to our roundtable discussions with our staff. So does anybody, just one here, Katie, and one here.
Hello? Can y'all hear me? Okay. Take a second.
Hi, my name is Desmond. I work with F7 Development. My question is for Mr. Hand and Mr. Barrie. Would you be an architect and understanding and being able to design based on price point? Are you seeing a uptick in the building materials that we use as far as instead of being from a ground up perspective, being from a more modular perspective to allow for the inefficiencies in regular home building today that has existed for the last 100 years to be able to fix that, because we build everything on an assembly line now. And so that question is for you. And then for you, if you don't say it's fine, then it never gets built. And so is that something that, are you saying in the banking world that they are getting behind as a viable option? Because in the past, everybody knows that modular was considered substandard. And in fact, the technology is well surpassed what it used to be, and so it's no longer substandard. So it's kind of a two-part question, I know.
Yeah.
The banking side of that actually is pretty simple. The industry has accepted modular building. So I have done modular projects where the walls were built off-site and then brought back together on-site and puzzle pieces put together. So, and I believe from a mortgage perspective through Fannie Freddie, who ultimately is the end holder of these mortgages, they will accept those as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in the architectural community in terms of design to what we call delivery systems, right? There's design and then there's delivery system. In terms of housing, there's panelized, right? And that's just like you just described, you know, that the wall panels and so forth come, you know, in some ways flat packed. And then there's modular ones where you're actually building, the units themselves or modules of the units. And there's some very interesting examples out there. There's an affordable housing project in the Lower East Side of Manhattan called Carmel Place. A marvelous video showing how this was assembled, and I visited it. It's a beautiful building. So there's a lot of interest out there. We're hearing about 3D printed houses and so forth. We'll see with that one. Does it? Are these kind of delivery systems appropriate for more small scale development? I'm not sure. Certainly in terms of economies of scale, we've seen them work for larger scale developments. I know David Baker is a big affordable housing firm out in the Bay Area of San Francisco, and I speak with David periodically, and he said, we're really making use of modular now, and it's really saving us construction costs. But these are, 150, 250, 300 unit buildings that they're doing.
Time for one more question, Katie. Thank you. And then we'll go into our roundtable discussions.
Thanks. My name is Tina Riley Humphrey. I work for Representative John Autry, who heads up what used to be Affordable Housing Work Group, which is now being called the Sensitive Income Housing Work Group. But my first question is a twofold question. How does the Housing Finance Agency come into play, being helpful or not helpful? What can they do, or what are they not doing? And then my second question is there a place for sustainable construction materials and technologies other than energy efficiency in small home building?
I can talk about the Housing Finance Agency. Every state has one, and they're largely, I'd say their biggest function is to facilitate the low-income housing tax credit program, where the IRS is divvying up tax credits to all the different housing finance agencies, and then projects are competing to get those tax credits and then sell those to investors and use that as the equity in affordable housing. So most affordable housing, about 90% of it constructed across the United States in the last 4 decades, was developed with this low-income housing tax credit program. And it's that equity that's really coming in, that's that, where instead of having to pass additional costs on to the renter, we've got this equity that doesn't require any repayment, so you can have a much smaller mortgage and keep rents low. So that's the function of the Housing Finance Agency. That's a bit of a controversial question. Like, what's my thoughts on the Housing Finance Agency? I think they're trying to meet the challenge of working in North Carolina, which is an extremely diverse state in terms of the different economies and the different urban or rural landscapes across the whole state. So they are tasked with kind of divvying out these tax credits with what's called a qualified allocation plan, that's sort of setting the rules of, what sites are acceptable, how close you have to be to a grocery store, what power lines can you not be near, and also setting all the design standards. They set things like parking requirements, minimum parking requirements. So imagine trying to do all these things, how close you have to be to a grocery store and how many parking spaces you need for a downtown Raleigh site versus a site in, Iredell County or something, extremely rural community. So, I think one of the challenges that I'd love to see the NCHFA come around to is be more accommodating on those parking requirements, because if you're trying to do one of those low-income housing tax credit developments in Raleigh and take advantage of, OMG, we don't need to have any parking at all, this is a friggin' miracle. I mean, I've been asking for this for years. Well, now Housing Finance makes you park, two spaces per unit or something, which is probably necessary, again, in a rural community, but not necessarily in downtown. So those are some of the challenges with housing finance that I think they'll eventually get there. They've already started differentiating some things with a small town versus a more urban area, and they understand the challenge. But they also administer the Supportive Housing Development Program, which specifically is housing for special populations, in particular people with disabilities and people who are homeless. CASA receives a lot of that funding. That's been critical in many of our developments, so that's a program they administer. They also administer lots of first-time home buyer stuff. I personally benefited that when I bought my first condo, took advantage of the mortgage credit certificate they offer. So they do a lot of things for the state. They're also, there's some challenges with the General Assembly providing the funding every year. So there's lots of lobbying to the General Assembly to say, let's get these funding streams that we rely on to, layer in financing on these tax credit deals in particular. Let's make those predictable instead of allocations annually and things like that. So if you're interested in that, or that's an area where you're working, I recommend you go visit the NC Housing Coalition's website, get on their newsletter. They do a Tuesday call every single week about what's happening with the legislature, and have lots and lots of information about all of that things on the affordable side.
And I can chime in on the second half of your question, which is there space for sustainability? And I think Topher can chime in on this too. Yes, there is. And I know that a lot of what we've been talking about today has been new construction, but I do want to make the point that renovating and repurposing existing spaces is the most sustainable work that you can do. And it's beneficial for the community. If you look at a rehab and the proportion of new materials versus labor versus a new construction project, new materials versus labor, you're creating more work and job opportunities on a renovation project. That's very sustainable, that's very beneficial for the community as a whole. So if you see opportunities to take a blighted, vacant building, renovate, add on, et cetera, you're building in sustainability. When it comes to sort of the formal track of sustainability and balancing it with affordability, I'll use an example that we were really excited about years ago was taking a property in a national historic district. Therefore, it was able to get historic preservation tax credits from the state preservation office. Typically, historic preservation is a little bit more expensive, which is why the state incentivizes with the tax credits to encourage people to renovate as opposed to tearing down. We were able to get that certified for tax credits at the same time as getting green certified. It was green certified because we followed NAHB's dual pathway. So they take a before snapshot and an after snapshot, and there are several suggestions on how you can green this home without having to have geothermal and solar and all the other stuff that pushes the price tag up. And there are a ton of great suggestions in there. So if you're doing any green project, I'd recommend looking at that just to see what some suggestions are for you to, for water use and things that you can implement in your projects to make them greener, more sustainable without having the expensive bells and whistles. And pulling both of those together allowed us to put it on the market for sale to someone at 80% AMI or less, which typically those three things do not fit together, and it took a lot of trade-off, but it's still possible.
Yeah, and there's a lot of passive ways that you can do it. Geothermal is an active system, passive ways. Just for example, just the materials that you use. We like to look at, kind of life cycle energy costs of materials, how much energy did it take to manufacture, how much to ship, and how much to recycle, right? And there are some good metrics out there. The Living Building Challenge, the Well Building Standard are two, and they're just good resources that that will provide prompts for things that you can look at when you're thinking about, in this case, sustainable materials.
Well, thanks. Let's hear it again for our panel.